yesterday when I arrived and I had a couple of hours to spend before I could enter the hotel, I walked and I intended to go to the Jewish Museum. It's not something that I usually do or the first thing that I would do in a foreign place, but I wanted to check my memory first, because I remember that when I visited here in '83 the last time, I saw a leaflet in the exhibition of the museum. I saw a leaflet signed by somebody called Schneider, or I saw the name Schneider, who was a Jewish partisan, and he was murdered by the Nazis. And I wanted to to see if I remember correctly that it was a leaflet signed by him or a leaflet telling that he was murdered. And this Schneider was a mathematician or a math teacher, and he taught my mother in Sarajevo as a child when she was in high school. So my mother was born in Sarajevo, and then she studied here in Belgrade in the 30s. And then she was a teacher in Montenegro, Cetinje, because she was not allowed to teach in the early 40s. She was not allowed as a Jew. She was not allowed to teach in Belgrade. She taught languages and French and literature. And then she was taken to the Gestapo and then later to Bergen-Belsen. She was a bit involved with the partisans. So being here, of course, is not just being any other place in Europe for me. And I wanted to see, and because my mother had very good memories about this math teacher, Schneider, who was, as she told me, everybody knew that he was a communist, but then communism, to be in the communist movement was, of course, illegal. And I wanted to see, but eventually I came too late, so I didn't enter the museum, because on the way there were many other attractions, like children playing violin in the main street, and it was somehow more interesting at that time to talk to them, but the museum is there. But I managed to get there, and there was a concierge, and he asked me where I was coming from, and I said from Israel. Usually I say Israel, Palestine, but at that time I said Israel, and he said, so what? And I said, I'm a journalist and I write about, so what are you writing about? I say, I write about the occupation. What? He looks at me and I say, yes, about the occupation. Which occupation? I say, Israeli occupation. So he says, but there is this is something to debate upon. It's not so obvious. I said, what's not so obvious, and who are you to tell me? And but he is the concierge of the Jewish Museum, so that's why he has to tell me that there is no occupation. And he said, but there is a Palestinian Authority. And I said, okay, I mean, I'll discuss it with you later or something, or I'm not here. I really didn't have the energy. So I'm here because now, obviously, because my mother left Belgrade and moved to Israel for all kinds of reasons after the war, not immediately, in '49 actually. So this is one reason that I'm here. And the second reason that I'm here talking to you is because there is occupation, and because there is so much A, B, and C that has to be told about this occupation. And that's more or less what I have to do, I feel. That there are so many basics that are related to this occupation that are not known. That's why I was invited. So in the early 90s, when many of you were not born yet, or were some years old, and then when Yugoslavia was falling apart and bleeding to death, there were still reasons in the world to believe that the end of the Cold War also brings with it some good results, not only bad results. Of course, there was Eastern Europe in general. People managed to dismiss very repressive regimes. There was South Africa, the apartheid in South Africa, that for you it might be already ancient history, but for us who grew up in the shadow of news about South Africa, we knew that it was not just racial, the epitome of racism, white racism. It was expressed in daily life. It was expressed in what they called the separate, unequal development of the peoples. So the blacks did not deserve the same development as whites deserved. This was the basic of the apartheid system. And the blacks were put, to make it a very short and maybe superficial, but they were destined to live in enclaves in the greater South Africa, enclaves which were called Bantustans, small homelands for them. They were deported to these homelands, they were expelled, and these homelands were deprived of any real sources, natural sources. And they were needed as cheap labor for the greater South Africa. But in short, they were confined to mostly to those Bantustans. And by the early 90s, these Bantustans were actually revoked or cancelled, or abolished, and the country was back to all, open to all. So this was a great result, maybe of the end of the Cold War, maybe as a result of the long fight of the South Africans, the black South Africans. And then there were the news about a looming agreement or a negotiation or accord between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it looked at the beginning of the 90s like, oh, they are on the path of negotiations and reaching peace. Such a long conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, such a long conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis, that here we are coming to solve it. And there was a common understanding among among many Israelis who called for peace, among Palestinians, among diplomats and foreigners and other countries who followed, that the end of these negotiations will result with the establishment of a Palestinian state. This has been the understanding that this is what the Palestinians have been waiting and fighting for, and this is a Palestinian state aside the state of Israel. And when the Palestinians and the Israelis signed an agreement called the Oslo Agreement in 93, then in 94, that was the general understanding. Now, so just to see more or less how the map of the Holy Land looks, between 48 till 67, this is how the map of, let's call it the Holy Land, looked. You had the blue part is Israel, and the yellowish is to the east, the West Bank, and then the Gaza Strip. Gaza was under Egypt military rule, and Jordan was, sorry, the West Bank was part of Jordan. Maybe for many of you it is too basic, but I just want to make sure that we are on the same foot. Then when Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank in 1967, the West Bank and Gaza became part of a space, part of the expanse from the sea to the river, which is under Israeli control. So actually, for the first time since 1948, the Palestinian people found themselves, who lived in the country, found themselves under one Israeli control. They did not have the same status, but still they were in one space, in one expanse, in the same borders. Now, of course, there are refugees, but let me concentrate here. And actually what was maintained for about 19 years until the 90s, or even more, actually more than 20 years, is that there was a sense that there is Israel, which is an Israeli expanse, and there are, of course, Palestinian citizens in the Israeli expanse, and there is a Palestinian expanse, the West Bank and Gaza. And almost from the start, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank had the freedom of movement to go within the whole expanse of the country, between the river to the sea, between the Mediterranean and the sea. And here is something that we can now understand with the hindsight of after 25 years, almost 50 years, is that this occupation had its positive sides, had its advantages. So as I said, for the first time, the Palestinians who live in the country feel that they live within the same borders. They met. For the first time after 19 years, people met each other. People of the same families who were split in the War of 48 could meet each other. Families could remarry. I mean, very often people from the same families or some extended family tend to marry each other. They started to renew marital connections. New families were created. People who are Palestinians who live in Israel could marry with Palestinians who live in Gaza or in the West Bank. They could have guests coming from all over. Now it looks, I say it, and I think that you think, oh, well, isn't it that obvious? Of course, it was not obvious until then, so it is something that should be remarked. I have friends who got married in Bet Hanun. It's here. They got married in 86, I think, or yeah, 86, and they had a band, musical band called Sabrine, coming to play for them in their wedding from Jerusalem and Ramallah, the players. And today people remember this with astonishment, and also then it was not something done every day, but it was possible. People studied together in the same universities, mostly in the West Bank. People from Israel, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, studied in Birzeit and Najah. People from Gaza studied there. There was in the 80s, there was a math class in Birzeit that half of them were from Gaza. Half of the people were from Gaza. And the only split was among those who supported Fatah and those who supported the left-wing organizations. People did commerce together. People went to work together. People worked in Israel. This opening of Gaza, this occupation, allowed many people, in a strange way, to go and become cheap labor for Israelis, but also to benefit as much as it was cheap labor for Israelis, it was a higher salary than they could get certainly in Gaza or the West Bank. So I know many people who managed to pull their families out of a very dire conditions, economical conditions, and really build up a future for their, if not for themselves, then for their brothers and for their children, thanks to this thanks to the work in Israel. Also opening the borders allowed Palestinians to meet the Israeli society. And actually to change many of its old conceptions about the Israeli society that was very abstract to most of the Palestinians who did not live in Israel. Israel was of course the entity that expelled, now we say ethnic cleansed, Palestinians in 1948. Israel is the country that goes out to wars against Palestinians and against Arab states every now and then. Israel is the country that oppressed the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. So the idea was that Israel is as bad as it sounds, and that it's also artificial, that it's a colonialist entity, that the society of Israel is artificial and should be actually undone, this society. And then when the borders opened and people started to see the Israelis, the Israeli Jews, things started to change, because the first thing that struck people, Palestinians, is that it might be a colonialist state, but it's also not anymore an artificial society. People started to get to know Israelis, to have business even with Israeli Jews, not only with Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And people had the freedom of movement. People could go from Gaza to Tabaria and from the West Bank to Gaza. Actually, in 1987, and I'll come to this in a moment, in 1987, when the first Intifada, first Palestinian uprising broke, and there was the leadership, very spontaneous leadership in Gaza, where they didn't have a stencil machine. That time the leaflets were printed on stencil, and the only stencil machine, which was of course underground in Gaza, broke. So they needed urgently to print leaflets. So they drove to Jerusalem and they went somewhere and they printed the leaflets and they returned by car and they hid it somehow, and then it was still open. And they came at night it was the very beginning of the Intifada. They came back to Gaza, distributed the leaflets in some mosques and some other places, and went to sleep. So I think that some of you might think, it sounds idyllic. Well, not really. It's not idyllic because still, we are talking about almost around 2.5 million people who were without any civil rights, under Israeli control, under Israeli military control. We're talking about people who paid taxes to Israel but did not have the civil rights, and we know why the American Revolution started. It was a regime that actually made people lose their right to live in their home, in their country, if they left abroad. If people went abroad, for example, to study or to travel and did not come back on time, they would lose their right to be in the country. There are at least 100,000 people who have been, after 1967, who were gone and could not be back because they were not in the occupied territory when the Israelis had the first census. And then some more tens of thousands of people lost their status of residency because they left. You have a regime that did not allow any free association. Any organization was not allowed. Of course, political parties were banned. And anybody belonging to a certain political or movement or party was subject to arrests and to interrogations. More than 3 people together is a demonstration, so people were not allowed to gather more than 3 people in the street. By the way, all these laws still are valid till today. People were called to the Israeli intelligence and interrogated and tortured. It took very long until Israelis believed that indeed the Israeli intelligence services torture people. There was a vast use, like any occupation or any colonialist occupation regime, there was a use of natural resources, land and water. It was forbidden to raise the Palestinian flag. Even going with the colors of the Palestinian flags were dangerous for people. Israel imposed military laws or military decrees that did not allow for any economical development in Gaza and the West Bank. Yes, people were allowed to go to Israel and develop Israel and have and offer their cheap labor there, but they were not allowed to develop and to develop the economy inside. There was no real investment in infrastructure in the occupied territory. Very basic development at the beginning, mostly connecting some villages and refugee camps to the electricity grid and to the water grid, but it was mostly for that was seen as mostly for as part of the occupation, not as part of giving services to people, because it had many conditions. There were arrests, as I said, and there was fear, all the time fear, and many books were not allowed, and the list is very long, which shows why the uprisings, first some uprisings, armed uprising of few groups in the 70s, and then some uprisings which involved more people and not armed during the 80s, why it was so natural for these uprisings to arise. And in 87, December 87, there was the first what we call the Intifada, the uprising of 87, when the people who went out and demonstrated and called on strikes and had spontaneous leaderships coming one after the other. One was arrested and then another came. There were 2 demands, one to the Israelis and one to the Palestinian leadership outside in Tunisia at that time. The demand from Israel was just get out of here. Just get out of our life here, end the occupation, end this military cruel occupation. And from the Palestinian leadership, the demand was accept and go on the 2-state solution. Accept to establish a state in Gaza and the West Bank. In these 2 small parts, which together comprise only 23% of the historic Palestine. So that was, on the part of the Palestinians, a huge compromise. A huge compromise because for Palestinians, the whole country is Palestine. And the whole country is the homeland of the native people, that more than half of them are refugees today. So this was an enormous compromise. But it stemmed out of understanding that the Israeli society is there, and that also nothing in history is final. That we are not talking about, excuse me for the term, final solution. Everything in history is can lead to another phase, any phase. The thing is, if we influence positively on the coming phase, then something positive can come yet from this phase and even be more positive. But people felt that the life under so many prohibitions and so much pressure, and without any ability to choose their own life, to decide about their own life, in short, to be sovereign in their own homeland, that this is enough. So the urge for statehood at that time was stronger than the urge for, or was stronger than the longing to the entire Palestine. People did not give up their longing to the whole country, but they understood that for the sake of the coming generations, statehood and independence and end of occupation in Gaza and the West Bank is the possible goal, is a realistic goal. And the feeling was common, even among people who advocated for many years something else, who advocated liberation of entire Palestine. The sense was that this is something which is possible and let's go for it. And why did it look possible? Because in the early 90s, and of course end of the 80s, early 90s, of course, in the Palestinian expanse, or the idea was that, or the understanding was that, okay, there is the Israeli expanse, but Gaza and the West Bank are a Palestinian expanse, a Palestinian space. True, it had some enclaves, which are Israeli enclaves. This is the settlements, but this was solvable. People, as somebody who lived at that time, it looked okay. So we dismantled those settlements. We dismantled those settlements, which are of course illegal according to international law. And we dismantled them. And this was the general idea. This was also among Israelis. It was very clear that no peace is possible with the settlements, all the settlements. That was a very common slogan, even of a movement which is quite mainstream and Zionist. I mean, people who genuinely back the state of Israel and its right to be a Jewish state. This movement said already in the late 80s, no peace with the settlements. It was understanding. It means that many of the Israelis thought, okay, we will not have peace, we prefer the settlements. But once the negotiations started, the understanding among people was, okay, there will be no settlements. Now we are 22 years after the Oslo initial declaration was signed, 25 years after or 24 years after the forerunner of the Oslo negotiations. The Madrid negotiations started. So we are 25, more or less 25, 22 years after. And we have a Palestinian president called Mahmoud Abbas. And the UN voted accepting Palestine as a non-member state. And there is a Palestinian government. And there is a Palestinian minister. So, should we be happy? In these 25 years, so in these 25 years now, or now 25 years later, Gazans are not allowed to go out of Gaza, and anybody else is not allowed to go inside Gaza. Most of the Palestinians cannot enter Jerusalem. Most of the Jerusalemites themselves, if they go and live 5 kilometers away from Jerusalem in what is called the West Bank, they are going to lose their right to be Jerusalemites. I'm talking about Jerusalemites who are Palestinians. So Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, who were born in Jerusalem, whose families were born in Jerusalem 200 years ago, who have houses that show how long they have lived in Jerusalem, if they dare to leave the country and stay outside, they are losing their right for residency. So they become stateless, or they are obliged to become citizens or residents of other countries. And then, if they have a chance to be allowed to go in Jerusalem for a visit as tourists. There are Israeli checkpoints all over the West Bank and separating the West Bank from Israel, military checkpoints, which make sure that nobody leaves, no Palestinian can leave if they don't have a special permit to do so. There are roads where only Israelis are allowed to drive in, and not Palestinians. There are exits from the West Bank to Israel where only Israelis are allowed to go through and not Palestinians. Even Palestinians with permits have to go through another place, through another checkpoint. In 60% of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank, Palestinians are not allowed to build, to develop, to drill for water, to develop, to even to connect a water pipe, even to connect a village to an electricity in 60%. Let me show you. Here you see the roads that connect, the network of roads that has been built over the past 25 years and actually connects Israel to the main Palestinian, to Israeli settlements inside the West Bank. That for Israelis now to drive in these roads, they think that they are in Israel. They have no idea that they are not anymore in Israel, because if they look at the signs only show, the signs are in only direct people to Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They might see some villages, Palestinian villages, but they don't even know their names. It's like a decoration. Israel is in 60% of the land. The Israelis are demolishing houses almost on a daily basis. In this 60% of the land, the Israelis can conduct military drills and force small communities, Palestinian communities, to leave their homes in order to enable the Israeli army to conduct military drills. You need in this, many Palestinians need an Israeli permit in order to build a cemetery, for example. Now, what is this 60% come from? You see here, it's the gray area. This is the 60%, but let me go to today, more or less. The white parts are, all in all, form 60% of the West Bank, which according to the agreements signed between Israel and Palestinians in the mid-90s, this land, this part of the West Bank should have gradually, until 99 or 99, should have gone under Palestinian, the full control, civilian and military control of the Palestinian Authority. And then in 99, there should have been a Palestinian state. This is how the Palestinians understood what they signed, and this is how they explained the situation to their own people. So it was only a temporary thing, the categorization of those 60% as still under Israeli control, full control, was only temporary. It was termed the Area C, but this is too technical, becoming too technical. Anyway, 20 years later, forget about it. There is nothing more permanent than the temporary. And here we have the situation again, just as it was 30, 40 years ago, only that it's in 60%, all the prohibitions to develop agriculture, to build, are still valid in 60%, not 100% of the West Bank, and of course not in Gaza. In Ramallah, for example, it took the city of Ramallah, which is considered the capital of the Palestinian Authority, it took them 15 years to get a permit to build a cemetery, a new cemetery, outside of those boundaries of the Palestinian controlled area. It was in the white area, you see? So outside of Ramallah, which is under the authority, under control of the Palestinian Authority. The only space which was available for a cemetery was in the white area, that is in the area under Israeli civilian control. It was private land or not private land, it doesn't matter. But it took 15 years to get a permit for this. Palestinians need a permit from the Israelis in order to put a new pipe for water. Not only for drills, but even to connect the Palestinian community to water, they need an Israeli permission. If they get it is another story, but the very thing that they still need a permission from the Israelis. In order to have a dumping site far away from a city, which is usually in Area C, because the Area C is more empty of people, the only condition that they can build, can have a dumping site, a new dumping site for the garbage, is if also the Israeli settlers can use it. Which means they demand the Palestinians to legitimize, to acknowledge the existence of the settlements. 25 years later of this Israeli, and all this time, if I forgot to say, there are peace negotiations. I mean, the whole world knows that the Israelis and the Palestinians are engaged in peace negotiations. In all these years, the Palestinian population registry is totally controlled by Israel. Palestinians who live abroad and want to go back and live in Palestine, and they are not residents they were not there when Israel had the census in 68 or 67, they cannot come and live and decide that they live with their family. And I'm not talking about the refugees of 48, I'm talking about people who left before 67 or after 67. If Israel does not authorize them to come back, they cannot come back. And you even have children who were born there in Palestine, in the West Bank. They were born in the West Bank, and they were not, Israel did not allow their registry because their parents were not allowed to be registered. So you needed the Palestinian Authority to fight for 15 or 20 years for such children to finally to have documents that they exist. Israel, and here you see the red boundaries, Israel built a wall, as you all know. And they say it's for security, but surprise, surprise, it goes deep into the West Bank, the wall. Now Palestinians need a permit to go to their land. You see, to the west of the red line, you see it? You have enclaves which are where Palestinians live, but they need a permit to go from one side to another, or they need a permit to go to their land, or they need their relatives, if they want to visit them in this part beyond the wall, they need a permit, which we don't know if they get or not. Usually they don't. If people try to protest or to resist, they are being arrested. And then again, we have arrests and interrogations by the Israeli intelligence, and the torture might not be as spread as 40 years ago, but people are being tortured and abused. There are many children who are being arrested, at least around 300 being arrested and detained from a few hours to a few days, and some are being convicted for throwing stones. So Palestinians live in the 40% of the land under Palestinian control, civilian control, and a limited policing control. Palestinian police has some authorities to act and to function in the big cities mostly, and the mostly populated, densely populated areas. And the rest is Israeli. So what do we have now, 25 years, after we thought that the West Bank is a Palestinian expanse with Israeli enclaves, we now have the opposite. We have Israel, which is Israeli expanse, and we have the West Bank, which is an Israeli expanse as well, Israeli space, with Palestinian enclaves, with Palestinian they call it in Hebrew, in the military jargon, territorial cells, where most of the Palestinian population is concentrated. And actually they can be separated from each other with one gate, gate which the Israeli military puts, with one road, with one settlement, with one military patrol. Whatever one of those methods is enough to cut one enclave from the other, or several enclaves from the other enclaves. Oh, sorry. In a way, you see it clearly here. It's a very complicated system of enclaves which are separated by, which are connected to each other by a thin road that, or some tunnels under the ground and the wall. And in a way, what I'm saying here, I know, is a very poor alternative to you coming on a visit. Because the truth is that it's very hard to explain how sly the system is, how offensive and abusive this system is. Because I'm not talking here, I haven't even reached the issue of killing, of the wars on Gaza, the killing of people. I'm talking about a situation that was built up during the 90s. We don't even reach the today's situation. And it's very hard to convey, especially in such times when there is so much bloodshed in other places, to convey why this situation is so oppressive, why it is so so humiliating if you don't come, if you don't go for a visit. Just the other week, last Saturday, I gave a tour which I call the Fivestar prison tour to 3 young Jewish women from the States. They are from J Street. It's an attempt of the Jewish community to give an alternative to the right-wing pro-Israeli Jewish lobby in the States. And I gave them a tour of about 3 hours, only in Ramallah area. And I call it the Fivestar prison tour because, of course, Ramallah is the richest place in the West Bank, or the only place where you feel that, oh, it's nice. There are cafes and restaurants and buildings and cars, very fancy cars. That's where and I had to go to all these details with them in order for themselves to see what it means that even the most luxurious place in the West Bank is actually an open space prison. Not only Gaza, which I didn't even start to talk about because this would have taken me 3 hours to explain how Gaza became the largest prison in the world, I guess now, where 1,800,000 people live and cannot leave and cannot have people coming to see them in general. So what we have here is that under the guise, during all these 20 years, the world says, oh, but there are peace negotiations. And the Palestinians are talking to the Israelis, and the Israelis are talking with the Palestinians. And the Israelis say that they want two-state solution. So what's wrong with that? So they'll overcome some of their differences. But what has happened in these 25 years that now the expanse in the West Bank is Israeli, the number of settlers rocketed in the last 20 years. Now there are many more, almost double settlers than there were in 91. For most of the Israelis, they cannot settle the difference between Israel and the West Bank. For them, it's just part of Israel, with some Arabs over there, but this is Israel. And for Palestinians, the space which was once known, now the space is contracted, split and fragmented to those, what we can call Bantustans, like in South Africa, those areas under self-rule, but without any really authority to develop. So they are fragmented, and the distance between every such enclave to another is much bigger than it used to be. Because now, because of all this system of roads for Israelis only, and settlements, and checkpoints, and roads only for Palestinians inside, and the Israeli patrols, now to drive from one such Palestinian enclave to another takes much longer than it used to. And people cannot go through Jerusalem, so you go bypass. So it has come to such a point that people just don't bother to go from one place to another. That you live in Jenin, you don't think of going to Ramallah. If you go to Ramallah, you have to make all kinds of calculations. How many soldiers you'll meet on the way? Can you be arrested? And how much will it cost you? Because the way is longer, so it's more costly. And I'm talking about these basics that relate to 2 million people. I know I just met a woman in Jerusalem. She is from the West Bank. She's married to somebody in Jerusalem. But because of the checkpoint, because it takes her, if she goes and visits her parents in Ramallah, and she leaves for the checkpoint, it can take her 1 hour, 2 hours to go through the checkpoint back home to Jerusalem. So she just gives up the idea. And I don't even start to tell you about this bureaucracy of permits, Israeli permits, for every different Palestinian in order to leave or to go and to get something, to do something. So under the guise of a peace process that the whole world hailed and keep hailing, and keep thinking that this is the only thing for Palestinians to engage in negotiations, under the guise Israel invented or expanded a series of bureaucratic regulations that confine the Palestinians into their enclaves, and the main enclave is Gaza and the West Bank, two separated enclaves. And then by the process of taking control or grabbing more and more land within the West Bank and allocating it for Jews, for Israelis, what happened, it managed to fragment the West Bank. In a sense that I say that when Israel says that they are for the two-state solution, I say no. Israel is actually in favor of the seven-state solution. The state of Gaza, the state of Israel, and then the enclaves in the West Bank. As we see, maybe Jenin will be a state of its own, and Nablus will be a state of its own, and Ramallah, of course, a state of its own, etc. So forget about the two-state solution. The negotiations today, if they resume, they are not about two states, they are about seven-state solution. Which means to enforce the Israeli idea of today is to force on the Palestinians an Israeli compromise. What is the Israeli compromise of these Bantustans, of these enclaves? The Israeli compromise is between the urge or the hope or the dream to see Palestinians disappear from the country, and between the understanding that politically this is something that is not doable now. We cannot repeat 1948. We cannot expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now to the neighboring states, as was possible in 48, in the time of 3 years after the Second World War, when there were 12 million refugees all over in Europe. It was possible to, to create other refugees and then hope that it will disappear. This is not possible now. So actually what is in fact happening is that Israel hopes to impose on the Palestinians a surrender arrangement by which they'll accept to live in Bantustans, in what was so normal in South Africa during the apartheid, to force this on the Palestinians, to accept the settlements remain and grow, to accept that 60% of the West Bank is Israel and Israeli, to accept that Gaza is separated from the West Bank and no connection, and then call it peace. Actually, this is what we can analyze from Israeli deeds. Maybe not what they are saying openly, or not all of them saying it openly, because officially the Israelis say, oh, they are in favor of continuing to negotiate about peace. But this is the peace that we see is in the mind of the Israeli establishment and the great majority of Israelis which support this establishment. I think I will end here because it's already very long that I've been speaking, and sometimes it takes time to explain the ABC, because I wanted actually to elaborate also on the last issue is if it's so horrible as it sounds, and maybe it is more horrible than it sounds. So the question is, and this I will leave open right now, how come there is no how come there is no new uprising against this Israeli military foreign rule? This is how I will end now. And let's open for questions. Thank you.